The town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, held its breath beneath a sky devoid of stars. The night was as black as pitch, the kind of darkness that swallowed even the bravest of whispers. Jack and Emily, two college students enthralled by the thrill of urban legends, had come to this small town in search of one thing: the truth behind the Mothman. The legend had drawn them like moths to a flame. Stories of a winged creature with glowing red eyes lurking in the shadows had circulated for decades, but it was the events of 1967, the collapse of the Silver Bridge, that cemented the Mothman as something more than just a local ghost story. People claimed the creature had been seen in the days leading up to the disaster, a harbinger of doom. "Think about it, Em," Jack had said when he first proposed the trip. "We could be the ones to finally document real evidence. No more blurry photos or secondhand accounts. Imagine what that would do for our futures." Emily had agreed, although with far less enthusiasm than Jack. The thought of coming face to face with something unknown filled her with a dread she couldn't quite shake. But her curiosity won out in the end. She convinced herself that the legend was just that, a story. But as they drove into town under the cover of night, her unease grew. They checked into a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. The old woman behind the counter gave them a strange look when they mentioned where they were headed. "The old TNT area, huh?" she said, her voice rough from years of smoking. "You kids better be careful out there. The woods ain't what they used to be." Jack just smiled politely and thanked her, but Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Something in the woman's tone made her feel like this wasn't just a friendly warning. After unloading their gear, they headed out to the TNT area, a sprawling, overgrown wasteland where the Mothman had reportedly been seen. The area had once been a munitions factory during World War II, but now it was a maze of abandoned bunkers, decaying buildings, and thick, tangled woods. Perfect for hiding something, or someone who didn't want to be found. As they drove, the roads became narrower, the trees on either side crowding in, until it felt like the darkness was closing in on them. The car's headlights did little to pierce the gloom, and every twist and turn in the road seemed to bring them deeper into an inky blackness that made Emily's skin crawl. "Are you sure about this, Jack?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jack glanced at her, his usual confidence waning slightly. "We've come this far. Let's just see what we find." They finally reached the TNT area, parking the car in a clearing where the road ended. The air was colder here, biting at their skin as they stepped out into the night. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of something metallic. Rusted iron or old machinery, perhaps. It was unnerving. Jack grabbed the flashlight from the back seat and handed Emily one of the cameras. "Stay close," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The bravado he'd shown earlier was all but gone, replaced by a tension that hung in the air between them. They ventured into the woods, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing nothing but trees and thick underbrush. Every step they took seemed to echo louder than it should have. The crunch of leaves and twigs beneath their feet, a harsh reminder of how alone they were. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, stopping in her tracks. Jack paused, listening. The silence was almost oppressive, as if the very woods were holding their breath. But then, just on the edge of hearing, came a faint, rhythmic thumping. It was a sound so subtle that, at first, Jack thought he was imagining it. But it grew louder, each beat reverberating through the ground like a distant drum. Jack's grip tightened on the flashlight. "Let's keep moving." They pressed on, the thumping growing steadily louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, something that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The trees around them seemed to close in, their branches intertwining above like a dark canopy that blocked out the sky. A sudden gust of wind blew through the woods, carrying with it a low, mournful wail. Emily froze, clutching Jack's arm. What was that? I don't know, Jack muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness. Probably just the wind. But Emily wasn't so sure. The wail had sounded almost human, like a distant scream carried on the wind. Her fear was building, a tight knot in her stomach that refused to loosen. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the thumping sound grew more intense, now accompanied by a low humming that seemed to come from all around them. It was as if the very air was vibrating, charged with an unseen energy. The flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the trees. Then, just ahead, something moved. Did you see that? Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jack swung the flashlight towards where she was pointing, but there was nothing there. Just more trees and darkness. He shook his head, trying to stay calm. It's probably just an animal. But Emily wasn't convinced. There had been something. Something large. Something that didn't belong. Her pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. The humming grew louder, the air thickening with an almost tangible tension. Jack stopped, scanning the trees with the flashlight. The beam caught something. 2 glowing red eyes staring at them from the darkness. Emily gasped, her blood turning to ice. The eyes were unblinking, fixed on them with an intensity that made her knees go weak. Jack took a step back, the flashlight shaking in his hand. Jack! Emily's voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. Before they could react, the creature moved. It burst from the trees with a speed that defied logic, its wings unfurling to reveal a massive, shadowy figure. The eyes blazed brighter, illuminating the grotesque form beneath. Dark, leathery wings, a twisted, almost human-like body, but with features distorted by shadow. Jack stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. Run! They turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. The creature gave chase, its wings beating the air with a sound like thunder, the rhythmic thumping now deafening. Emily's breath was ragged, her legs burning with every step, but the sheer terror propelling her forward was stronger than any pain. Branches whipped at her face. Thorns snagged her clothes, but she didn't dare look back. The sound of the creature's wings filled her ears, growing louder, closer. She could feel it, a looming presence just behind her, its breath hot on the back of her neck. Jack! She screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony. Just ahead, the trees began to thin. The faint glow of the town's lights, barely visible through the darkness, but the creature was almost upon them. Emily could feel its claws raking the air so close that she could hear the swish of them slicing through the night. With a final burst of adrenaline, they broke through the tree line, stumbling into the open field. But before they could reach the safety of the town, the creature let out a screech so loud it felt like a knife to the eardrums. Emily tripped, falling hard to the ground as the creature swooped low, its claws grazing her shoulder and tearing through her jacket. She screamed, the pain sharp and immediate. Jack was there in an instant, grabbing her and pulling her to her feet. They half ran, half stumbled towards the nearest cover. A small, abandoned shed on the edge of the field. They crashed through the door, slamming it shut behind them. Inside, it was pitch black, the only sound their ragged breathing, and the pounding of their hearts. They pressed themselves against the far wall, listening as the creature circled outside, its wings beating the air in frustration. The walls of the shed creaked under the pressure, the wood groaning as if it might give way at any moment. Emily clutched Jack's arm, tears streaming down her face. The red eyes flashed outside the small window, scanning the interior, searching for them. They held their breath, praying it wouldn't find them. Minutes passed, each one an eternity. The creature's wings finally receded into the distance, its presence fading, until all that remained was the distant thumping, growing fainter and fainter. They didn't move, too terrified to even breathe. When they were sure it was gone, Jack carefully peeked out the window. The woods were silent, the town's lights still far off, but tantalizingly close. "We have to go," he whispered. Emily nodded, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. They crept out of the shed, keeping low, and made their way across the field as quickly and quietly as they could. Every shadow, every rustle of wind, set their nerves on edge. But the creature didn't return. They reached the town's edge, just as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the sky lightening to a pale gray. The sight of the familiar streets and buildings felt like a lifeline, something solid in a night full of horrors. They didn't stop until they reached the door of the motel. They burst inside, slamming the door behind them, their chests heaving with exertion and terror. The dim, flickering light in the lobby was a welcome contrast to the oppressive darkness they had escaped. The old woman at the counter looked up from her newspaper, her eyes narrowing as she took in their disheveled appearance. "Looks like you two saw something out there," she muttered, her tone almost accusatory. Jack could barely speak, his throat dry and his body trembling. Emily, still clutching her shoulder where the creature had grazed her, managed a weak nod. We saw it," she whispered. "The Mothman." The woman's expression darkened. She set her newspaper down with deliberate care and leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Did it follow you?" Jack shook his head, though he wasn't entirely sure. "No, I don't think so. We hid. We got away." The woman's eyes flicked to the window as if expecting to see the creature peering in. "You'd better hope that's true. Once it's seen you, well, it doesn't like to let go. Some folks say it marks you, that once it finds you, it always comes back." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The old woman leaned back in her chair, her face shadowed in the dim light. "You'll see, or maybe you won't, if you're lucky. But if you're smart, you'll leave town at first light and never come back. The Mothman doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive." The words hung in the air, heavy with a sense of finality that made the blood in their veins run cold. Jack and Emily exchanged a glance, both realizing the gravity of what they had encountered. The terror in the woods wasn't over. It had only begun. Without another word, they turned and made their way to their room, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the silent halls. They locked the door behind them, but it did little to ease their nerves. They knew sleep would be impossible that night. Every sound outside would keep them on edge, every shadow a potential threat. As they sat on the edge of the bed, the reality of their situation sank in. The Mothman had seen them, marked them perhaps, and they had no idea what that meant. Emily shivered, pulling her knees to her chest as Jack stared blankly at the wall, lost in thought. When dawn finally broke, they packed their bags in silence. The sky was a dull gray, overcast, with a promise of rain, as if the world itself was mourning the horrors of the night before. They checked out of the motel without another word to the old woman, who watched them go with a knowing look in her eyes. As they drove out of Point Pleasant, the weight of what they were leaving behind settled over them. The town, the woods, the creature, they all seemed like a distant nightmare now, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of their minds. They didn't speak of it again, but the experience changed them. Every so often in the dead of night, Emily would wake with a start, her heart racing, sure that she could hear the faint sound of wings beating just outside the window. Jack would reach out to comfort her, but the unease in his eyes told her he felt it too. The Mothman had marked them, and though they had left the town behind, the terror of that night followed them, a shadow that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They would never forget the glowing red eyes, the feeling of being hunted, and the certainty that, no matter where they went, the Mothman was out there, watching, waiting, and someday, it would come for them again.